The vote was already done when I walked into the chamber. I had arrived 3 minutes late. Not because I overslept. Not because I lost track of time. I was late because I had learned, over 11 years of sitting in that chamber, that arriving early made you look eager. And in the Galactic Council, looking eager was the fastest way to make yourself irrelevant. My name is Oliver Crane. I am 44 years old, born in Bristol, raised partly in Nairobi, and I have spent the last 11 years as Earth's senior diplomatic observer at the Galactic Council's permanent session hall on Karanath Station. Observer, not delegate, not representative, not member. Observer. It is exactly what it sounds like. I sit, I watch, I write things down. I do not speak unless spoken to, and I am almost never spoken to. That was fine. That was always fine. That was, in fact, the entire point. I took my seat in the back row of the observer gallery, which is separated from the main floor by a long panel of sound-dampening glass. The glass is supposedly so that observers can hear the proceedings clearly without disrupting them. In practice, it means that the council members below can look up at the gallery, see the minor species seated behind the glass, and look away again without feeling any obligation to acknowledge us. I had watched the Vethkai Supreme Chancellor do exactly that, 431 times. I had counted. The session that had just concluded was the Council's 1,200th General Assembly. It should have been a routine resource allocation review. Those sessions were boring, even by Galactic Council standards, which meant they were the kind of boring that made you feel your own heartbeat as a way of confirming you were still alive. Commodity rights reviews, trade lane reclassifications, planetary zoning amendments, the sort of administrative work that kept 1,200 civilizations loosely aligned and mostly not in open conflict with one another. I settled into my seat and opened my notebook. It was a paper notebook. People always found that strange. The council chamber was lined with holographic display surfaces, real-time translation arrays, quantum-linked data feeds running at speeds that would have seemed like magic to anyone born before the contact era, and I used a paper notebook with a carbon-tip stylus, the same kind I had used since my first year on Karanath Station. There was a reason for that, too. The woman beside me was called Nora Fields. She was Earth's second observer, 2 years into her posting, still in the phase where she sat slightly forward in her chair and paid attention with the intense focus of someone who believed attention alone could change outcomes. I had been that person once. I remembered it the way you remember being 17, with fondness and mild embarrassment. Nora leaned toward me and said, in a voice quiet enough that the sound dampener would absorb it before it reached anyone on the floor, "You missed the vote." "I know," I said. "It passed. I know that too." She looked at me with the expression people used when they thought I was being deliberately unhelpful. "Oliver, they just reclassified our solar system as unoccupied frontier space. They voted to erase our territorial claim. Earth doesn't legally exist under galactic property law anymore." I uncapped my stylus. "When did the resolution pass?" 16 minutes ago. "Unanimous?" 11 abstentions. The rest voted yes. I wrote the number down. 11 abstentions. That was actually more than I had expected. I had projected 7. I made a small note beside the number, a question mark, and then the word interesting. "Oliver," Nora said, and her voice had dropped even lower, and now it had a different quality in it, not panic. Nora was too controlled for panic, but something close to the edge of it. "What do we do?" I put my stylus down on the notebook. I looked through the sound-dampening glass at the council floor below. The Vethkai delegates were already packing up their data slates, moving with the brisk efficiency of people who had just completed a task and were ready to move on to the next one. Vethkai always moved like that. They were tall, pale carapaced, with 4 upper limbs and the kind of collective confidence that came from 600 years of military dominance. They had controlled the Council's Security Council vote for nearly 2 centuries. They did not lose votes. They did not expect to be challenged. They had looked up at the observer gallery exactly once during the session, at the moment when Resolution 7 Omega was read aloud, and one of them had caught my eye through the glass. He had looked away in under a second. That was the part I kept coming back to, even now. Under a second. I had been sitting in this gallery, or ones like it on other stations, for 11 years. Before me, Earth's observer had been a woman named Carol Dutton, who served for 9 years, and wrote 400 detailed reports that the Galactic Council never read. Before Carol, it was a man named Peter Ash, who served 7 years and was so thoroughly ignored that when he died of a cardiac event in the observer gallery during a session on mining rights, the session continued for 22 minutes before anyone noticed. I knew these things because I had read every report, every file, every scrap of documentation that Earth's diplomatic corps had produced since first contact, 91 years ago. I had read them not because I was told to. I had read them because in the first week of my posting, I had sat in this gallery and looked at the council floor and understood something very clearly. The Galactic Council was not evil. It was not malicious, not in the way stories made villains malicious. It was something worse and more ordinary than that. It was indifferent. It had simply never developed the habit of thinking about humanity as something that required thought. We were a developmental ward. We had no fleet large enough to threaten anyone, no resource base the Council considered significant, no ancient history of galactic citizenship that demanded respect. We had shown up to the table 91 years ago with our hands open and our voices polite, and the Council had looked at us the way you look at a plant, someone left in the corner of a waiting room. Not unkind, not hostile, just not particularly relevant. And for 91 years, Earth had been quiet. Quiet in the observer gallery, quiet in the back channels, quiet in the resource negotiations, where we always accepted the minimum allocation without complaint. Quiet when the Council restructured the trade lanes in a way that cost Earth's outer system mining operations 40% of their efficiency. Quiet when the Vethkai military conducted exercises within range of our deep space relay stations without filing the required notification. Quiet when 3 separate charter amendments had been introduced that would have, if passed, further limited Earth's ability to expand beyond our current registered territory. We had been quiet about all of it, and while we were quiet, we had been doing something else. Nora was watching me. I realized I had not answered her question. "What do we do?" I said. Not a question, just repeating the words back to feel their shape. "We've been doing it for 11 years, Nora. We've been doing it for 91. She waited. Resolution 7 Omega was filed by the Vethkai delegation, on behalf of the Resource Expansion Committee, I said. That means it went through the Resource Committee first, which means it was reviewed under Charter Article 44, subsection 9, which requires a minimum 30-day notice period for any resolution that affects the territorial status of a registered candidate civilization. I picked up my stylus again. When was the notice period filed? Nora pulled up her data slate. Her fingers moved quickly. She was good at research. That was why I had asked for her. Specifically, when the second observer position opened. She found the filing timestamp and went still. 17 days ago, she said. I wrote that down too. 13 days short of the required 30, which makes the vote procedurally invalid under the founding charter, which means every council member who voted yes was either unaware of that violation or aware of it and hoping nobody with standing to object would notice. The word standing hung in the air between us for a moment. But we don't have standing, Nora said carefully. We're observers. We don't have standing to vote, I said. We have standing to file a procedural challenge. There's a difference. Article 88 grants any registered entity, including candidate civilizations, the right to challenge any resolution that directly affects their territorial designation. I closed my notebook. The challenge has to be filed within 48 hours of the vote. Oliver, Nora was looking at me with something I hadn't seen on her face before, something that was closer to real fear than the controlled alertness she usually wore. If we file a challenge, we're not observers anymore. We're participants. They will see us. I picked up my notebook and stood. Nora, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I had trained myself to for 11 years. They should have been paying attention a long time ago. I walked to the door of the observer gallery. Behind me, through the sound-dampening glass, the Vethkai delegation was filing out of the chamber. They did not look up. I set my hand on the door and thought about 91 years of silence. I thought about Peter Ash, dying in a gallery, while a session on mining rights continued below him. I thought about the 400 reports that were never read, and the trade lane restructuring, and the charter amendments, and the 11 abstentions that were more than I had projected. 11 civilizations had hesitated. 11 had not been comfortable enough to say yes. That was the thing about silence. If you used it correctly, it didn't make you invisible. It made you a container. And for 91 years, Earth had been filling that container, very carefully, with everything it would eventually need. I did not smile. That would have been too much. But I felt something settle in my chest, something that had been waiting a long time to land. I opened the door and walked out. The 48 hours began now. The first call I made was not to Earth. It was to a Salundri legal archivist named Velarath, who owed me a favor from 2 years ago, when I had quietly steered a trade route amendment away from a clause that would have inadvertently damaged Salundri shipping interests. Velarath had never thanked me directly. That was not how the Salundri worked. But he had said, once, in passing, in the way the Salundri said important things, that he considered me a careful person, and that careful people were worth remembering. I called him from the corridor outside the observer gallery. The corridor was empty at that hour. Karanath Station ran on Council Standard Time, which meant it was late in the administrative cycle, and most of the staff were either in the session hall or in the dining sector on level 4. Velarath answered on the third signal. He was gray-scaled, broad-shouldered in the way of his species, with 2 sets of eyes that could focus independently. Both sets focused on me at once. That meant he was paying close attention. "Mr. Crane," he said. His translator rendered his words in clean, flat English. "The session concluded some time ago. I assumed you would be resting." "Resolution 7 Omega," I said. "I need the procedural filing history, specifically the notice period submission timestamp and the committee review chain." One set of eyes shifted slightly. "That is a matter of public record." "I know." "I need it formatted for an Article 88 challenge submission. I need it in 42 hours. Both sets of eyes were fully on me again. "You intend to file a challenge?" "Earth intends to file a challenge." "Yes." Velarath was quiet for a moment. The Salundri were the Council's legal architects. They wrote the charter amendments. They reviewed every resolution for procedural compliance. They were, in the political geography of the Council, the people who knew where all the bodies were buried, because they had drafted the burial permits. Velarath did not express emotions in ways that were easy to read, but the quiet that came before his next words was the kind of quiet that meant something. "The notice period was 17 days, he said. "I am aware of this. You reviewed it." "I reviewed the committee submission, yes." "And you passed it through." Another pause. I raised a concern with the committee chair. The concern was noted and set aside. I understood then. Velarath had flagged the violation. Someone above him had decided to ignore it, and Velarath, who was a careful person, had documented his concern and let it go, because challenging the Vethkai Resource Committee was not something a Salundri archivist did lightly. But documenting it meant the concern existed on record. "Velarath," I said, "is your concern still in the record?" "It is," he said. "Archivists do not delete concerns. It is a professional principle." "Then I would like to include it as supporting documentation in the challenge filing, with your permission." He looked at me for a long time, both sets of eyes, fully focused. "You have my permission," he said. "And Mr. Crane?" "Yes." "You will want to know that there are 11 delegations who voted in abstention. I can tell you, informally, that 3 of them have reached out through back channels in the last 30 minutes to inquire about the procedural standing of candidate civilizations under Article 88. My hand tightened slightly on the stylus I was still holding. "Which 3? "The Kethavari, the Mulan Collective, and the Rindari Federation." I knew all 3. Small civilizations, no military force worth measuring, combined resource base that the Vethkai would calculate as irrelevant. All 3 had spent decades being treated by the Council in ways that rhymed uncomfortably with the way Earth had been treated. "Thank you," I said. "I will be in contact." I ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment. 11 abstentions. Velarath's documented concern. 3 delegations already reaching out through back channels, and a procedural violation that was 13 days wide, sitting in the public record, waiting for someone with standing to notice it. 91 years of notes, 91 years of watching, 91 years of filling that container. The next call was to Earth. I reached the Global Council's diplomatic liaison. A man named Gerald Ford, no relation to the former president, who had held the liaison position for 8 years, and who was the kind of person who answered calls at any hour, without complaint, and without sounding like he resented you for it. I had always respected that. "Oliver," he said, and from the background sound, I could tell he was already at his desk. It was 3 in the morning in Geneva. He had been waiting. "You know," I said, "we've been watching the feed for 16 hours. We saw the vote come in." He paused. "The Secretary General wants to know your recommendation." I thought about how to say the next part. I had been composing it, in some form, for 11 years. "Tell her," I said, "that the challenge is procedurally airtight. The violation is on record, independently documented by a Salundri archivist. We have 33 hours left in the filing window. If we file in the next 12, we get the procedural advantage of acting early. It signals confidence. And if we file, we're no longer observers." "No, the Vethkai will not be pleased." "No," I said again. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear Gerald breathing, and somewhere behind him, the faint sound of someone else in the room. Someone who hadn't spoken. Probably the Secretary General herself, listening. "We've been quiet for 91 years, Gerald said quietly. "Yes. And you think now is the time?" I looked back down the corridor, toward the observer gallery door. Through the window in the door, I could still see the chamber below, emptying now, the holographic displays powering down one section at a time, the great curved tiers of the council floor going dark from the outer edges inward. "They made the mistake," I said. "That was always going to be what decided it. Not us, not some plan we came up with in a boardroom somewhere. They made an error, a real, documented, verifiable error. And they made it because they were not careful, and they were not careful because they had never been forced to be careful around us." I paused. "That changes tonight." The Secretary General's voice came through then, clear and direct. I had met Caroline Webb twice in person. She was a small woman with short gray hair, and the manner of someone who had spent 30 years making decisions that mattered, and had learned to make them without hesitation. "File it," she said. "File it now." I was already walking. The filing office on Karanath Station was technically open around the clock, staffed by a rotating series of administrative clerks from 6 different species. The clerk on duty when I arrived was a young Kethavari woman, one of the small avian-descended species, with blue-tinted feather structures around her temples that flattened when she was startled. They flattened when I walked in. "Observer Crane," she said. "The session has concluded for the—" "I'm not here as an observer," I said. I placed my data chip on the desk. "I'm here to file an Article 88 procedural challenge on behalf of the registered candidate Civilization of Earth. The challenge concerns Resolution 7 Omega, voted on in today's General Assembly session. I have a documented procedural violation, a Salundri archival record of an internal concern, and the contact information for 3 co-filing delegations who will submit their own supporting notices within 6 hours. I met her eyes. "I need a filing timestamp and a confirmation number." The feather structures around her temples did not unflatten, but her hands moved to her terminal. Professional. She was good at her job. "Filing now," she said. The confirmation number came through in 40 seconds. I read it, wrote it in my notebook, and thanked her. I walked out of the filing office and into the corridor, and for the first time in 11 years, I felt the station air differently. It was the same recycled, temperature-controlled, slightly metallic air it always was. Karanath Station had never smelled like anything, except Karanath Station. But something in it had changed, or something in me had. I thought about what Nora had said. If we file a challenge, we're not observers anymore. We're participants. They will see us. I thought about Velaroth's quiet, about the 11 abstentions, about 3 delegations reaching through back channels, inside 30 minutes of the vote closing. I thought about a man named Peter Ash, dying in a gallery, while a session continued below him. Then I walked back to my quarters, sat down at my desk, and began drafting the full challenge document. Not because it was required tonight, the filing timestamp was already secured, but because the next morning, when the Council's administrative office opened the filing and read Earth's name on an Article 88 challenge for the first time in history, I wanted every word to be exactly right. I worked until dawn, The administrative office opened at station hour 7. The challenge notification reached the council president's desk by 7:14. I know this because Velarath sent me a single message at 7:16 that said, "It has been received." No other text. Just those 4 words. By 8 o'clock, my comm unit had received 9 incoming calls from council delegations. I did not answer any of them. Nora came to my office at 8:23. She had a look on her face that was caught somewhere between exhilaration and the careful kind of fear that comes not from believing something will go wrong, but from understanding for the first time how large the thing you have started actually is. "The Vethkai Supreme Chancellor has requested an emergency session," she said. I know. The council president granted it. Session is at 1300. I know that too. She sat down in the chair across from my desk. How do you know all of this before I do? I've been monitoring the feeds all morning. Velarath has a counterpart in the president's office, I said. A Mulan collective archivist named Sorellen. Sorellen and Velarath share a professional communication channel that is technically a closed archive forum. It is not on the monitored feed. I looked up. They are both careful people. Nora stared at me for a moment. How long have you known about that channel? 6 years. And you've never used it before. I never had anything worth sending, I said. Until now. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then, what's going to happen at 1300? I set down my stylus and leaned back in my chair. Outside the small porthole window of my office, Karanath Station's exterior observation ring was visible, and beyond it, the pale wash of the system's star, far enough away to be gentle. I had looked at that view for 11 years. It had always looked the same. This morning it looked slightly different, sharper maybe. Or maybe I was the one who was different. The Vethkai are going to walk into that session, expecting one of 2 things, I said. Either we've made a procedural error in the challenge filing, which they will use to dismiss it, or we haven't made an error, which means they need to shift to a political argument. They'll claim Earth doesn't have legitimate standing, because we're a candidate civilization, and not a full member. They'll argue the Charter's Article 88 right was intended for full members, and has never been tested against candidate status. And what do we argue? We argue what the text says. Article 88 is not limited by membership tier. It says registered entity. Ent. The text is clear. I paused. But legal clarity is only part of it. What's the other part? I thought about the 11 abstentions again, about the 3 delegations who had co-filed their supporting notices at 6 in the morning, quietly, exactly as I had asked. The Kethavari notice had been precise and formal. The Mulan collective notice had been brief. The Rindari Federation notice had been 2 pages long and cited 4 separate charter articles, which told me they had a legal team and had been preparing for something like this for some time. That last detail was interesting. The Rindari had not been waiting for us specifically. They had been waiting for someone. For any candidate civilization with the combination of nerve and documentation to go first. We had gone first. And that changed what they were willing to do. The other part, I said, is that this is not just about Earth. The Vethkai resolution was filed on a procedural shortcut that affects every candidate civilization. There are 31 registered candidate civilizations in the council system. Resolution 7 Omega set a precedent that their territorial claims can be reclassified with a 17-day notice instead of 30. That precedent, if it stands, is a template. I paused. For doing this again. To any of them. Nora went still. You think the Vethkai want to do this to more than just us? I think the Vethkai Resource Committee has identified 17 star systems belonging to candidate civilizations that contain materials they want access to. I think Resolution 7 Omega was a test, a proof of concept. If it passed without challenge, they would have had a working method. I looked at her. It did not pass without challenge. Because of the Article 88 filing. Because of 91 years of paying attention, I said. The filing is just the mechanism. Nora was quiet again. This was one of the things I respected about her. She did not fill silence with noise. She sat in it and thought. It was a skill that took years to develop, and most people never managed it. The other 31 candidate civilizations, she said finally, do they know what we know about the 17 star systems? 3 of them do now, I said. I sent the resource mapping data to the Kethavari, the Mulan Collective, and the Rindari this morning. 2 hours ago. She blinked. Where did you get resource mapping data on 17 candidate civilization star systems? From the Vethkai Resource Committee's own filed reports. They're public documents. The committee is required to file resource survey results with the General Archive as part of the standard environmental review process. I allowed myself a small pause. They are not required to summarize those results in plain language. Most delegations look at the summary. I read the full reports. All of them. All of them. Over the last 4 years. Nora looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I had not expected. "Oliver," she said quietly, "how long have you known this was coming?" I thought about that. About when exactly the picture had assembled itself clearly enough to see the whole shape. About the first time I had read a Vethkai resource survey, and noticed that 3 of the 17 star systems appeared in 2 separate reports filed 18 months apart, and that the second report was more detailed, more focused, the kind of detail that meant someone had gone back for a second look. 4 years, I said, give or take. And you didn't tell anyone? I told the Global Diplomatic Council. I filed a report in year 2 of the pattern. It was classified and held. The recommendation was to continue observation. I looked at her steadily. So I continued observation. And collected everything. And collected everything. She was silent again. Then she stood up, smoothed her jacket, and said, "I'm going to prepare the session notes for 1300. Do you want me to draft a speaking position?" "Draft 3, I said. 1 for the procedural argument, 1 for the standing argument, and 1 for the political argument. I want options. And which one will you actually use?" I picked up my stylus and turned back to my desk. "All of them," I said, "in whatever order they make necessary." Nora walked to the door. She paused there for a second, her hand on the frame, and she said without turning around, 11 years, Oliver. Was any of it boring?" I considered the question honestly. "Every single day," I said, "and none of it." She left. I kept writing. At 1300, I walked into the council chamber, for the first time in 11 years, not through the observer gallery door, but through the main floor entrance, the same entrance used by full member delegations, the same tiled corridor that the Vethkai walked every session, and the Salundri, and the Prayathi, and all 1200 civilizations that had been voting in this chamber since before most of humanity's nations had developed writing. I walked through that entrance with my paper notebook and my carbon-tip stylus, and I took a seat at the floor-level delegate table. The chamber was already full. It was louder than any session I had ever heard from behind the sound-dampening glass, and then it went, by degrees, very quiet. The Vethkai Supreme Chancellor was in his seat at the head delegation table. He was looking at me, not looking away in under a second this time. I opened my notebook to a fresh page, and I began. The emergency session of the Galactic Council lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. I had prepared for 3 scenarios. I needed all 3. The Vethkai Chancellor opened with the standing argument, exactly as I had predicted. Their senior legal voice, a tall delegate named Orath, made the case with the kind of rehearsed confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged in a legal setting before. Article 88, Orath said, was designed for full member states. Candidate civilizations were a provisional category. Applying the article to a provisional entity would destabilize the procedural architecture of the entire charter. He spoke for 22 minutes. I had 12 minutes of prepared response, because 12 minutes was the floor time allowed to a challenger under the Council's procedural rules. I used 10 of them. I cited the text of Article 88 directly. Registered entity. Both words were defined elsewhere in the Charter, and I cited those definitions too. The Charter's own glossary defined registered entity as any civilization formally recognized in the Galactic Register, which included candidate civilizations by explicit inclusion in the registration article, Article 12. I had the page numbers. I had the document dates. I had the amendment history showing that the definition of registered entity had been expanded to explicitly include candidates 43 years ago, in an amendment that the Vethkai delegation had voted in favor of at the time. That last point landed in the chamber, with the weight of something dropped from a significant height. I used my remaining 2 minutes to note, calmly, that the procedural shortcut used in Resolution 7 Omega was not unique to Earth. I presented the names of 16 other candidate civilizations whose territorial designations had been surveyed by the HFY Resource Committee. I did not make accusations. I presented the filed documents. I let the chamber read the dates. The noise level in the chamber went from very quiet to something I had never heard before in 11 years of observation. It was not shouting. It was not anger. Exactly. It was the sound of 1,200 delegations recalculating simultaneously. The HFY chancellor called for a recess. I sat at the delegate table during the recess and drank water from the glass Nora placed in front of me. Through the floor-level windows of the chamber, I could see the space beyond the station. The same star I could see from my office. The same pale and distant light. 37 minutes into the recess, a Prayathi aide came to the delegate table and placed a data chip in front of me without a word. I picked it up and read the message stored on it. The Prayathi delegation, it said, wished to request a private consultation at Earth's earliest convenience. The message was signed by the Prayathi senior delegate, a figure who had been a reliable HFY ally for the last 12 years. I handed the chip to Nora. She read it and raised both her eyebrows. The Prayathi, she said. Yes. They voted yes on 7 Omega. They did. And now they want a consultation. Apparently. She thought about this. They're hedging. They're deciding which direction the current is going, I said. Which is information. The recess ended. The session resumed. The HFY, to their credit, adjusted quickly. Orath abandoned the standing argument and shifted to the political one, that the resolution had been filed in good faith, that the procedural violation was minor and technical, and that the intent of the council had been clearly expressed in the vote, which represented the will of the overwhelming majority of member states. I responded, in my remaining floor time from the next question period, that the Charter did not have a provision for good faith exceptions to mandatory notice periods. The Charter said 30 days. The filing had been 17. The math was not ambiguous. The Salundri bloc, all 43 delegations, voted to suspend Resolution 7 Omega pending procedural review. They cited Velarath's archived concern as the basis. 43 votes. That was not enough to decide the session, but it was enough to make the suspension technically viable under the Council's own procedural rules. The Council President, a rotational position currently held by a Mulan collective elder named Savan, called for a procedural compliance review. Resolution 7 Omega was formally suspended pending that review. The review timeline was set at 60 days. It was not a victory. Not yet. It was a pause, a delay, a door held open instead of slammed. But I had been in this chamber for 11 years, and I knew the difference between a pause that closes and a pause that becomes a permanent condition. The difference was what you did with the time. When the session ended, I walked out through the main floor entrance again. Nora was beside me. Around us, delegations were filing out in various states of conversation and calculation. No one spoke to me directly. Several looked. In the corridor outside, 3 delegates were waiting. The Kethavari senior observer, the Mulan collective second delegate, the Rindari Federation legal advisor. They were standing together, not quite formally, in the way of people who have arrived at the same location from different directions and are still deciding what that means. The Kethavari spoke first. Mr. Crane, we wish to express our appreciation for the supporting documentation you shared this morning. It was public information, I said. Anyone could have read it. Yes, the Kethavari said. And yet. The Rindari legal advisor said, more directly, we have 32 candidate civilizations who should be having this conversation, not just 3 co-filers. 32. I agree, I said. Are you prepared to facilitate that conversation? I thought about the 60-day review window. 60 days, and 32 civilizations who had been sitting in observer galleries, behind sound-dampening glass, for years. Yes, I said, I am. We made arrangements to meet the following morning. That night, alone in my office, I opened my notebook to the page where I had written 7 Omega, and the date, and the 11 abstentions, and the word interesting. I drew a single line under it, and wrote the date of the session. Then I sat for a while and looked out the porthole at the pale star. It had been there for about 4.5 billion years. It had no opinion about galactic politics. It just kept shining. I found that steadying. Tomorrow would be the second day of the rest of everything. I had work to do. The meeting happened in a room I had booked under the category of Standard Archival Research Consultation, which was a category that required no special approval and generated no significant notification to the Council's administrative log. I had noticed, in the third year of my posting, that research consultations were the most invisible category of meeting on Karanath Station. Archivists booked them constantly. No one monitored the guest lists. By 8 in the morning, 11 delegations were seated around the table. By 10, 3 more had sent representatives. By the time I poured the third round of water, and Nora had given up trying to take formal notes because the conversation had become too fluid for a traditional record, 14 candidate civilization delegations were in the room, and 2 more were listening via encrypted comlink from their home stations. The Rindari legal advisor, whose name was Owen Hartley, a detail I found quietly amusing, given that Owen Hartley was about as human a name as a name could get, and yet he belonged to a species that had evolved on a planet 600 light-years from Earth, was the one who brought the conversation to its point. "We have looked at the survey data Mr. Crane shared," Owen said. He had a precise, careful way of speaking, the kind that came from spending a career in legal settings. "We have cross-referenced it with our own territorial records. The Vethkai Resource Committee has conducted detailed surveys of 14 of our registered territories. The surveys predate Resolution 7 Omega by between 2 and 8 years. The pattern is consistent with what Mr. Crane's analysis suggested." The room was quiet. "They were building a list," said the Mulan Collective's second delegate, a young woman named Selava, who used English as her chosen translation medium, which she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a third language. "They identified what they wanted, and they built a legal mechanism to take it. They built a legal mechanism to try," I said. "The mechanism required the 30-day notice shortcut to work. They needed it to pass before anyone with standing to object had time to prepare an objection. It did pass," said the Kethavari delegate. "It passed in 11 hours, I said. "They did not count on a challenge filing within 48 hours. They did not count on supporting documentation being available immediately. They expected at least a week of confusion while Earth decided what to do." I looked around the table. "They expected that, because that is how long it takes most candidate civilizations to navigate a crisis. They did not account for the possibility that Earth had been accounting for this specific scenario for 4 years. Another pause. Longer this time. "How many documents," Selava asked, "are we talking about?" "Earth's diplomatic archive relating to Galactic Council procedural history contains approximately 400,000 individual records," I said, "cross-referenced by topic, date, filing entity, and outcome. The resource survey data is a subset of roughly 12,000 filings over the last 9 years. I paused. "Every one of them is public record. None of them required any special access." "You just read them," Owen said. "I just read them," I said. "All of them." The room was quiet in a different way now. Not stunned, exactly. More like the quiet of people revising a picture of what had been happening while they weren't watching. Selava said, almost to herself, "How does a species get to the point where it reads 400,000 documents?" 91 years of practice, I said. And a lot of observers who understood that their job was not to be seen. It was to see. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, we had a draft framework. It was not a treaty. It was not an alliance. It was something quieter, and, I thought, more durable than either. It was a shared information structure, a system through which the 32 candidate civilizations would pool their observational records, cross-reference their data sets, and build a collective picture of what was happening in the Council, that no single small civilization could build alone. I had a name for it in my notes. I had been thinking about it for 3 years, since before I had any reason to believe it would ever be needed. I had not shared the name with anyone yet. It felt premature. I would wait. After the others had left, Nora and I sat at the table, with the last of the water and the late afternoon light coming through the porthole, and she said, "The 60-day review is a problem." "It's a constraint," I said. "There's a difference. The Vethkai will spend the 60 days lobbying the review committee. They have relationships with every member of that committee. They have decades of political capital invested in those relationships. They do, I said. We have a procedural argument and 3 co-filing delegations. We have a procedural argument, 14 delegations in that room this morning, and 400,000 documents, I said. And we have the fact that the HFY Resource Committee conducted surveys on 14 candidate civilization territories, which means 14 delegations now know that they were on a list. I folded my hands on the table. Nora, when the people on that list find out how close this came to working, what do you think they're going to do for the next 60 days? She thought about it. Lobby their own relationships on the review committee. Lobby their own relationships, I said, and share information with each other through the framework we just built, and file their own public records requests for the survey data, and talk to the Solundri legal bloc, who are already on record as supporting the procedural challenge, about what a clean charter means for the stability of the entire system. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were building this for a long time." "I was building the possibility of this," I said. "The HFY built the specific version of it. I just watched where the pieces were going." She nodded slowly. "What happens if the review committee rules in favor of the HFY anyway? If they find a way to validate the procedural shortcut?" It was the question I had been sitting with for 3 days. I had an answer. I was not entirely comfortable with it, but it was honest. "Then we appeal to the full council," I said. "And we bring 32 delegations into that chamber. And we present 400,000 documents of public record, and the resource survey data, and the timeline, and the fact that a Solundri senior archivist documented a procedural concern that was overridden, and we let 1,200 civilizations decide whether the charter means what it says. And if 1,200 civilizations decide it doesn't, then we learn something important about what kind of system the Galactic Council actually is," I said, "and we make decisions based on that." Nora held my gaze. "What kind of decisions?" I looked out the porthole. The star was beginning to shift toward its second phase spectrum in the station's synthetic day cycle. It turned a slightly different color in the late afternoon. Not warmer, exactly, just more itself. "The kind," I said, "that 91 years of careful preparation makes possible." She understood. She did not ask me to be more specific. We sat in the quiet for a while longer, and then we went back to work. 3 weeks into the 60-day review period, the Galactic Council Administrative Office received a joint submission from 22 candidate civilizations. The submission was not a legal challenge. It was a document, a comprehensive procedural audit of all resolutions filed in the past 12 years, cross-referenced against the Charter's mandatory notice and review timelines. Of the 341 resolutions reviewed, 67 contained procedural irregularities. Not all of them were significant. Not all of them had passed. But 14 of them, it turned out, had directly or indirectly affected the territorial designations or trade access rights of candidate civilizations. 14 resolutions. Over 12 years. A pattern. I did not release the document. The 22 delegations released it jointly, through their own official channels. I had shared the methodology with them 3 weeks earlier. They had built the audit themselves, using data from their own archives combined with the shared framework we had established. I was not the author of the document. My name was not on it. This was deliberate. The document landed in the Council's administrative inbox at station hour 9 on a regular session morning. By station hour 10, it had been forwarded by the Council President's office to all 1,200 member delegations. By 11, the Prayathi senior delegate had issued a public statement distancing the Prayathi delegation from the HFY Resource Committee's filing methodology. By 1300, 2 of the HFY's longest-standing political allies had issued joint statements calling for a full charter compliance review. The 60-day review period ended with the Procedural Compliance Committee's report. The committee, after considerable internal debate that produced a 200-page minority dissent, voted 8-5 to find Resolution 7 Omega procedurally invalid. The resolution was struck from the record. Earth's territorial designation was restored, and the committee's report included, in its appendix, a recommendation that the Council establish a permanent candidate civilization liaison committee, with the authority to flag procedural concerns in real time before votes were called. I read that appendix recommendation alone, at my desk, at midnight, with my notebook open in front of me. The recommendation used different language than I would have used. It cited different precedents than the ones I would have chosen. It was written by committee members I had never spoken to directly, but it said the thing I had spent 4 years building the groundwork for. Not just the thing about Earth, not shells, the larger thing, the systemic thing. The thing that was not about one planet and one procedural violation, but about what kind of system the Galactic Council was going to be. I wrote the date in my notebook. I wrote the committee vote, 8 to 5. Then, in the margin, I wrote the word, beginning. Because that was what it was, not a victory, not an ending, not the part where you put down your pen and say the work is done. The beginning of a different kind of attention, a different kind of presence. I closed the notebook. I turned off the desk lamp. I looked out the porthole for a moment, at the star in its fourth phase color now, deep and steady. Then I went to sleep, for the first time in 6 weeks, for more than 4 hours. The next morning, I had work to do. I was sitting at the permanent delegate table on the main floor of the Galactic Council chamber for the 63rd time when the Vethkai made their second move. I had been seated at that table for 9 months, not as an observer behind sound-dampening glass. As Earth's permanent candidate delegate, a designation that had been formalized in the 41st day of the compliance review period, when the Council President had ruled that an entity engaged in an active Article 88 proceeding was entitled to floor-level participation rights for the duration of the proceeding. The proceeding was technically closed now, since 7 Omega had been struck, but the President's office had not rescinded the participation status. I had not asked them to. They had not raised it. We had all collectively pretended not to notice, which was itself a form of communication. The chamber had changed in 9 months. Not physically. The same tiered seating, the same holographic display surfaces, the same sound architecture. But the texture of it had changed. The way attention moved through the room, where people looked when they walked in, whose table they paused near. They paused near mine more often than they used to. The Vethkai's second move was not another resolution they had learned from the first. Instead, it was a proposed amendment to the Charter's Article 12, the one that defined registered entity, the definition that had been the foundation of Earth's challenge. The proposed amendment would add language specifying that Article 88 challenge rights applied only to full member states, not to candidate civilizations. If the amendment passed, it would close the door we had walked through. Retroactively, it would not undo what we had done, but it would ensure that no candidate civilization could do it again. I received the amendment text at 7 in the morning. By 8, I had sent it to the framework. By 9, Owen Hartley had sent back a legal analysis. By 10, I had read every previous attempt to amend Article 12 in the Council's history, of which there had been 7, and the vote records for each one. 4 of the 7 had failed. The 3 that passed had all been expansions of the article, not restrictions. The Council had, historically, been more willing to expand rights than to contract them. This was not altruism, it was politics. Contracting rights created opponents. Expanding rights created potential allies. The Vethkai Amendment was proposing a contraction. They were doing it because they needed to close the door. They needed to do it badly enough that they were willing to pay the political cost. I spent the rest of the morning thinking about what that meant, about how bad the exposure from the 12-year audit had been for them, about how many of their former allies had quietly shifted since the Compliance Committee ruling, about the fact that they were making a reactive move, and reactive moves told you things about the state of the person making them. They were afraid, not of Earth, specifically, afraid of the framework, afraid of what 22 candidate civilizations sharing information and building joint submissions looked like when it kept producing accurate, well-documented, publicly filed results. Afraid of what it would look like in another 9 months, in another 3 years. They were trying to cut the root before the tree grew any larger. At 1300, I took my seat at the delegate table, and the session opened. The Vethkai Amendment was not on the formal agenda yet. It had been submitted for consideration, which meant it was in a queue for review before it could be scheduled for a vote. That queue, under normal council procedure, was managed by the Administrative Committee, which was currently chaired by a Salundri elder. I had spoken with Velarath the previous evening, not about the amendment directly, about the Administrative Committee's procedural calendar. Velarath had mentioned, in the way he mentioned important things, that the committee's calendar was quite full for the next several months, that it was unlikely any new amendment would reach the scheduling stage quickly. Several months. The framework needed several months. I thought we could use them well. The session that afternoon was on trade lane realignment in the outer sectors. It was, objectively, a deeply boring session. I sat through it and took notes, just as I had taken notes for 11 years behind the glass, except that now, I was taking notes at the table, and the chamber could see me doing it, and several delegations had by now understood that what I wrote in my notebook had a way of showing up in submitted documents later. Near the end of the session, the Rindari senior delegate, who had recently been upgraded from observer to candidate delegate status, following a separate but related procedural action, came and sat briefly in the empty chair to my left. Rindari body language was not easy to read, but I had been studying their delegation for 3 years, and I had learned the basics. She was uncertain about something. "Mr. Crane," she said quietly, "the proposed amendment. It will not reach a vote for some months," I said, keeping my voice low and even, as if we were discussing something unremarkable. "The administrative calendar is full." "And in those months," I said, "the framework continues. The joint submissions continue. The public record continues being what the public record is." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Vethkai have approached 3 candidate civilization delegations in the last week. Privately, they have offered to withdraw the amendment in exchange for those delegations withdrawing from the framework." I kept my eyes on my notebook. I wrote a word I had been meaning to write for a week and made a small star beside it. "Which 3? She named them. 2 were civilizations I had been less sure of. The third surprised me. I had thought they were more committed. "What did they answer?" I asked. 2 have not yet responded. The third has told the Vethkai they will consider it." I wrote consideration in my notebook, then crossed it out. "They will not withdraw," I said. "Not in the end." "How can you be certain?" "Because the Vethkai's offer has a condition. Withdrawing from the framework means giving up the information sharing, the joint submissions, the collective audit capacity. It means going back to being a single voice behind a glass panel." I looked up briefly, and then back at my notebook. "Those 3 delegations have seen what the framework produces. They've read the audit. They know their own territories were on the survey list. The Vethkai are offering them safety from a door that's already been opened, in exchange for closing the window they're currently using to breathe." The Rindari delegate was quiet for a moment. "That is a persuasive analysis. They will consider it," I said, "and then they will decline. And the Vethkai will know that the approach didn't work, and they will have to decide what to try next." "And what will they try next?" I thought about it honestly. The Vethkai were a 600-year-old military civilization with a vast political network and resources that dwarfed anything the framework could produce in 9 months, or 3 years, or probably a decade. They were not going to run out of moves. They were not going to simply accept the change in the chamber's texture and adapt gracefully. But they were also operating under constraints, now that they had not been under a year ago. The audit was public. The Compliance Committee's ruling was precedent. Velarath's archived concern was in the record. And 1,200 civilizations in this chamber had watched a candidate civilization walk through the main floor entrance with a paper notebook and a procedural challenge, and they had watched what happened afterward. The question of what the Vethkai would try next was real, but so was the question of what the chamber had already decided about what kind of council it was willing to be. "I don't know," I said, "and that's fine." The Rindari delegate tilted her head slightly. A gesture I had learned, over 3 years of watching their delegation, meant genuine curiosity. "You are not concerned about not knowing?" "I'm always concerned," I said. "That's different from not being ready." I closed my notebook. "We've been ready, in one form or another, for a long time." The session ended at station hour 16. I walked out through the main floor entrance and down the corridor toward my office. The corridor was busy at this hour, delegates and aides moving in both directions. Several nodded as I passed. A few spoke brief greetings. One Prayathi aide, someone I didn't recognize, looked at me for a moment longer than usual, with an expression I couldn't quite read. I filed it away. Not everything needed immediate interpretation. Sometimes things just needed to be noted. In my office, Nora was at her desk with 3 data slates open, cross-referencing something she had not yet told me about. She had developed the habit, over 9 months, of running her own threads of analysis independently and bringing them to me when they were ready, rather than at every step. I had encouraged this. The framework was stronger, with more minds working it from different angles. The 3 delegations the Vethkai approached, she said without looking up. I had flagged 2 of them for follow-up last week. There was a pattern in their framework submissions that suggested they were receiving pressure from outside the group. You flagged it last week and didn't tell me? I wasn't sure yet. I'm sure now. She looked up. They'll hold. Both of them. The third I'm less confident about, but I think the Rindari have a relationship there that we don't. I'd suggest asking Owen to reach out. I looked at her for a moment. When did you start thinking about the Rindari as a relationship resource? 6 months ago, when Owen mentioned in passing that he had studied at the same Galactic Law Institute as the 3rd delegation's senior advisor, before either of them were working in diplomatic roles. She held my gaze steadily. I noted it. It seemed potentially useful. I was quiet for a second. Nora, I said. Yes. You're going to be very good at this. She looked, for a brief moment, as if she might say something. Then she turned back to her data slates. I know, she said. I've been paying attention. I sat at my desk. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. Outside the porthole, the star was deep in its 4th phase spectrum, the color it turned in the late station afternoon, steady and old and indifferent and, from this particular angle, very beautiful. I thought about Peter Ash, about Carol Dutton, about the 400 reports that were never read, about 91 years of observers sitting behind glass and watching and writing things down and being ignored. And then I thought about 14 delegations in a research consultation room, about an audit that had reached 1,200 desks in a single morning, about an amendment sitting in an administrative calendar that was very full, about Owen Hartley and a Law Institute connection 6 months old and already useful, about Nora, who had been paying attention. The notebook was about half full now. I had been using this one for 9 months. The ones before it were filed in the archive room 3 doors down from my office, labeled by year and cross-referenced by topic. 43 notebooks in total, going back to my first week on Karanath Station. 43 notebooks, 400,000 documents, 11 years of water in a container. I picked up my stylus and started writing. Tomorrow there would be a procedural calendar meeting. The week after, a trade block session. In 3 weeks, the framework's 2nd joint submission was due, and I had already read the draft twice and had notes on 4 points that needed sharpening. In 2 months, the Vethkai amendment would still be sitting in the administrative queue, and the question of what they tried next would begin to have clearer shape. And somewhere in between all of that, the council was continuing to change, slowly.
The way large things change. Not with a single moment of reversal, but with 1,000 small adjustments that accumulate into something irreversible. I was not the one making that change.
The change was being made by 14 delegations who had learned to share information, and 22 who had filed an audit, and 8 compliance committee members who had decided the charter meant what it said, and a Salundri archivist who had kept a concern in the record because archivists did not delete concerns, by a Rindari legal advisor with a coincidental connection to someone who needed a friend, by Nora, who noticed things 6 months before they were useful. I was the person who had been quiet for a long time in a gallery, watching the floor, writing things down. And then I had walked through the main entrance, and everything had changed shape. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of a moment of heroism, or a confrontation, or a reversal of fortune so complete that the gallery broke into applause. Because of a filing, a procedural document, airtight and boring, and exactly correct, submitted 41 hours before a deadline. That was the thing about this kind of work. It was not exciting, most of the time. It was reading. It was note-taking. It was long meetings in unremarkable rooms, talking through frameworks and methodologies and calendar logistics. But it was the kind of work that accumulated. And accumulation, I had learned, in 11 years behind a glass panel and 9 months on the floor, was the most powerful force in any room. I wrote until station hour 20. Then I put down my stylus, closed my notebook, and went to find dinner. The star outside the porthole had shifted to its evening spectrum, A deep and patient color. Very old, very bright, very far away. It had been shining for 4.5 billion years. It would keep shining for several billion more. I thought we were probably fine. The vote on the Permanent Candidate Civilization Liaison Committee happened on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because Nora had written Tuesday in large letters on the small physical calendar she kept on the corner of her desk, with a circle around the date and 3 question marks, which was her way of marking things that were important but whose outcomes were uncertain. She had started the calendar 7 months ago. It had a lot of circles on it. Most of the questions had been answered by now. The Liaison Committee proposal had originally come from the Compliance Review Committee's appendix, which was a recommendation and not a resolution. Someone had to convert it into an actual proposal for a vote. That someone had turned out to be a coalition of 9 member delegations, 3 of whom were Salundri, 2 were mid-tier member states with long histories of supporting charter reform, and 4 were candidate civilizations that had been upgraded to candidate delegate status in the last year. Earth had not formally submitted the proposal. Earth's name was on the list of supporting delegations, 1 name among 9. I had helped draft the procedural language. That was, as far as the public record was concerned, the extent of my involvement. The vote required a simple majority, 733 yes votes out of 1,200 possible. At 8 in the morning, I walked onto the council floor and took my seat at the delegate table. Nora sat to my right. The Rindari senior delegate had taken her usual position, 2 tables to my left. Around the chamber, 1,200 delegations were finding their seats, checking their data slates, preparing for the session. It was supposed to be a full session day. The Liaison Committee vote was the 5th item on the agenda, after 2 trade route reviews, an environmental impact report on a contested mining sector, and a credentials review for a newly registered candidate civilization. I sat through all 4 items. I took notes. I drank water. I watched the chamber the way I had always watched it, with the same attention and the same patience. The Liaison Committee item came up at station hour 14. The proposal was read aloud by the session clerk, a Mulan collective official who had held the position for 20 years and who read council documents with the flat precision of someone who had read several thousand of them and understood that the words mattered more than the performance. The primary sponsor of the proposal gave a 4-minute statement. It was clear, well-organized, and cited 3 charter articles and 2 precedents. I recognized the structure. I had suggested it. The Vethkai response was 2 minutes. It was careful in a way that told me they had decided not to spend significant political capital opposing this particular proposal. They had fought the Compliance Committee ruling. They had tried the amendment approach. They had reached out to framework members and not moved them. They had calculated, I suspected, that the Liaison Committee was less threatening than the framework itself, because a committee inside the council's own structure was something they could eventually influence from within. They were not wrong about that, but it would take them years. And by then, the framework would be further along. The vote opened at station hour 15. I watched the board. 1,200 positions, each one representing a civilization, flipping from pending to yes or no, or abstention, as delegates submitted their responses. The first 100 came in quickly, the next 200. The split was holding around 60% yes. At 500 votes counted, it was 4-6 against. My stomach did something it rarely did during sessions. I wrote the numbers down. At 700, it had moved to even, exactly even, 350 each way. Nora said very quietly, "It's going to be close." "Yes," I said. The last 400 votes came in over 20 minutes. The chamber, which had been chattering through the earlier items, was unusually quiet. Everyone could see the board. Everyone was watching the numbers. 702, yes. 712. The threshold was 733. At 728, it stalled. The remaining votes were still pending. I counted the pending lights on the board. 9 delegations had not yet submitted. 5 submitted in the next minute. 3 yes, 2 abstentions. 731, 2 votes short of the threshold. 4 delegations still pending. I looked at the 4 pending lights on the board. I did not know 3 of them. They were small member states, long established, not part of any major bloc, the kind of delegations whose votes were genuinely independent, and genuinely unpredictable. The fourth, I knew it was a mid-tier member state called the Avenari, who had been a consistent Vethkai ally for 12 years, but who had been among the delegations that filed public statements calling for the charter compliance review. They had been moving, over 9 months, in a direction. I had watched it. I had noted it in my notebook 3 times. The third unknown delegation submitted. Yes. 732. 1 short. The Avenari light was still pending. Nora, to her credit, did not grip the table, or say anything, or make any of the small physical expressions of tension that you would expect from someone watching something like this. She sat perfectly still. She had learned that too. The Avenari submitted. The board updated. 733. The exact threshold. The session clerk announced the result in the same flat, precise voice she used for everything. The Permanent Candidate Civilization Liaison Committee was established. It would have 12 seats. 4 reserved for candidate civilization delegates, rotating on a 2-year cycle. It would have the right to flag procedural concerns to the session chair in real time. It would submit quarterly reports to the council president. It was not a transformation. It was a structure, a mechanism, a door inside the building that had not been there before. I wrote the vote total in my notebook, 733. Then I wrote, 11, the number of the first abstentions, 11 months ago, that had told me something was possible. I looked at the 2 numbers for a moment, then I put a bracket around them and wrote, difference between the start and the possibility of the start. Oliver, Nora said quietly. I looked up. You should know, she said, that the Avenari senior delegate came to the framework meeting last month, the one on legal methodology. She came as a private observer. I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure it was relevant. I looked at her. She asked good questions, Nora said. Careful questions. The kind you ask when you're not ready to decide, but you're trying to understand what you'd be deciding. I thought about the Avenari's pending light on the board, the 4 remaining lights, 3 unknowns, and 1 I had been watching for 9 months. When did she arrive at the meeting? I asked. Early, Nora said. She arrived early and sat in the back row. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about what it meant to arrive early and sit in the back row and ask careful questions and watch, and not quite decide. I knew something about that. Thank you, I said. I closed my notebook around the chamber. The session was moving to the next item on the agenda, something about navigational hazard updates in a disputed transit corridor. The normal machinery of 1,200 civilizations, loosely aligned and mostly not in open conflict, continuing to turn. I looked at the observer gallery. Behind the sound-dampening glass, the observers were watching the floor, the same view I had had for 11 years. From here, at floor level, I could not see their faces clearly, but I knew what it looked like from up there. I knew what the chamber looked like through that glass. From a distance, with the sound filtered out. I knew how it felt to write things in a notebook, knowing that no one on the floor could see you doing it. I thought about what I would say if I could somehow speak to whoever was sitting in that back row right now, looking down. Keep going, I thought. Keep writing. It counts. All of it counts, even when it doesn't feel like it, especially then. I did not say it out loud. There was no way to say it out loud from here. But I picked up my stylus and wrote it in my notebook, in the margin of the page with the vote totals, in the smallest handwriting I had, which was still perfectly legible because some habits were permanent.
Keep going.
It counts. Then I looked up and paid attention to the navigational hazard report, because that was the work. It was always the work, not the moments of arrival, or the votes that came in at the exact threshold, or the paper notebooks that turned into 400,000 documents. It was the attention, the daily, ordinary, unremarkable attention. That was the thing the Galactic Council had never understood about us. It wasn't the trap in the outer solar system. It wasn't the procedural challenge, or the resource survey data, or the compliance audit. It was the attention. 91 years of it. And counting. The navigational hazard report concluded. The session moved to the final item. Outside the porthole, the star was doing what it always did at this hour, shifting through its spectrum, old and steady. I opened my notebook to a fresh page, and I kept going.